It's very different. The country has changed. We're talking about more than 6 decades, and the attitudes have changed. The politics have changed. I can say with all certainty that the reception today for unaccompanied minors in Florida is not welcoming at all. Back then it was.
You mentioned it's been 60 years. Was it a slow change in attitudes, or was there an inflection point, a particular decade where those attitudes and responses began to change?
My answer to that would be in the last 10 to 15 years. Immigration has become politicized. Back then, that wasn't the case. And we should remember that immigration is a matter for the federal government. It's not a state area of activity, but of course, the government of the state and the Dade County do have an impact.
How much of Florida's growth has been due to international migration?
Well, it's interesting. I've worked on comparing the antebellum and Civil War era period, comparing it with what has transpired in this country over the last 12, 15 years. And one interesting fact is that the percentage of foreign-born residents in this country back then was around 13%. Guess what? Today, it's roughly the same number. So there's some parallels there. And, it's a historical reaction when you have large influxes of people from other countries, whether it was the Chinese in the 19th century or other groups, even the Italians, which are part of the mainstream fully in this country, they were regarded as people of color. We don't have to go that far either. I mean, the Irish, for example. So whenever you have a large influx of foreigners who bring their own culture, their own languages, and their own practices, I see that as enriching the welcoming country. But for many people, that's a source of fear. Some of it regarding the labor market. Immigrants sort of bring down the wages for everybody else. So that's part of the reaction.
Is there any way to track or any way to know what percentage of those migrants that are doing that work are undocumented?
Once we're working here in Florida, that would be very hard to figure out and come up with an accurate number. What I can tell you is that since the new Florida legislation starting July 1st, which severely restricts the employment of undocumented workers, we have seen, and it's widely known, increasing difficulties to hire workers for the harvest, whether it's melons or other products. So the fact that we're seeing these difficulties means that it was a substantial presence. Some of them, I suppose, continue to work. I don't think, if I recall correctly, that law applies to small employers, but it's significant.
This can be very different from different people from what I do understand, but how do people come to Florida legally? And how, if at all, how have the reasons changed that people migrate here to Florida?
Legally. Well, I know a little bit of that because I was born in Cuba. My family left early on during the revolution. We settled in Peru. And my father had to spend a long time waiting, producing documentation, visiting the U.S. Embassy in Lima, Peru, where we lived, and it was a matter of years. So there are mechanisms, but they take a long time. And the reasons change. For example, we have seen in the last 20 years or so a dramatic increase in the immigration of people from Venezuela. Not as much from Colombia, but very substantial as well. So it's a matter of largely the economic situation in the sending countries and also the politics. We're witnessing an increase in migration of Colombians, for example, to Florida, and it relates to the new leftist government of Petro in that country. In Venezuela, we've witnessed this for a long time, and since the COVID pandemic, a massive increase in the number of Cubans coming to Florida. We need to understand that laws cannot fully stop a process, a human process of people who have become desperate in their own countries. They're going to live. We've seen this in Cuba with the boat people, the balseros, risking their lives, and that didn't stop them. So we can anticipate that this flow, as circumstances deteriorate further in some Latin American countries, that we're going to see that growing. So it's almost, when you look at where people are coming from, it's almost a thermometer of the fever, the level of fever in these particular countries.
We often hear when we're discussing the reasons, when the lawmakers are discussing the reasons why they passed these laws, we hear references to Florida's economy, school system, healthcare system. What has been the impact of immigration on Florida's economy, school system, healthcare system? And is there really a way to account for the undocumented effect on those systems?
Well, there are two sides to this aspect as well. On the one hand, you have the contributions, and the contributions have a lot to do with being part of the workforce and also being consumers. There are many studies that have been conducted on the positive impact of immigrants into the state of Florida and elsewhere. And again, generally positive. Now, on the other hand, we shouldn't discount this because it's a reality when you have a large population of immigrants, and not just immigrants, but the children of immigrants as well. When you have that, it puts some pressure in certain areas. Schools, for example. Few people are aware of the fact that, and this is not just Latinos, but that the majority of students in public schools, the majority of the population is non-white. That's quite significant. On the other hand, I teach at the University of Central Florida, and Central Florida has become a Hispanic serving institution, which is a federal designation. And what I see there is just positive influences of a increasingly diversified student body. They take courses that I teach: history of the Caribbean, history of Puerto Rico, history of Cuba. So some people just have this image that immigrants come here just to take away. Well, that's not quite accurate. Some do, as we have in all racial groups, people who just don't contribute to the system. But then on the other hand, the contributions have been very robust. I forgot to mention taxpayers. That adds to the state economy as well.